Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I hope everyone can hear us okay. So today our presentation is really talking about redesign and how it's been impactful in the Catholic schools in a variety of facets. And so to begin, we'll introduce ourselves.
So hello, my name is Vince Bustamante and I am the curriculum consultant at Edmonton Catholic Schools. Majoring, I guess, in social studies, and I am also engaging in a little bit of work with John Hattie and worked on a book that was called Great Teaching by Design. And I also just want to take a second, I know Louise was going to do this, but I would just like to acknowledge that wherever you're tuning in from, that we are on treaty land and we are treaty people, and we would just like to acknowledge that we share in the land that was crossed by people and Indigenous groups centuries before us.
And good afternoon, my name is Tim Kisak and I serve as Deputy Superintendent of Edmonton Catholic Schools. And again, we're very happy to have this opportunity to talk to you today in terms of high school redesign and particularly how it's helped shape us in terms of our preparation for our COVID response. The topics we're going to address today start with educator roles, again, one of the pillars of high school redesign. But in terms of what are the responsibilities in terms of TQS and LQS, we're going to look at how the pillars of redesign have helped shape our reentry planning. Vince will be detailing some information in terms of our professional learning and collaboration and quality teaching. And then very briefly, just sort of the pillars of redesign 10 years later, what do we know? What do we understand? How are they holding up? I had the opportunity to first engage with high school redesign when I was assistant principal at Archbishop O'Leary High School. We were one of the first pilot schools, one of the first 16. And this is when we were immersed to the pillars. And when we look at these pillars, we clearly understand that high school redesign was clearly meant to be more than a matter of time. It was to look at those facets of educational praxis that really help us understand how we might better engage students and learners, and beyond that, include students in elements of education for their own voice and choice in education. I'm going to start by focusing on educator role and professional development. And for me, when I see the words educator roles, to me the word responsibility comes top of mind. Why? Well, if we think of this particular quotation from Sir Ken Robinson, we consider the impact that educator roles, professional learning and collaboration have on quality teaching. I had the good fortune of meeting Sir Ken Robinson 5 years ago in Chicago, and I was blessed to have a half hour of his time. By this point, I was 6 years into my high school redesign journey. And this is when Sir Ken was talking about creative schools. What are the conditions we need to create in order to provide optimal learning opportunities for our students? And so I had a great opportunity to talk about the work that we had been doing in high school redesign, particularly the collaboration across the province and working with other jurisdictions, the opportunity to get together for the colloquiums and talking to each other, sharing those ideas. And so this is something that Ken Robinson said to me. And this is where, again, that word responsibility really comes top of mind for me. So when we think of educator roles and responsibilities, we're mindful that as a classroom teacher, as a school-based leader, as a systems leader, we are all involved in a learning culture. And as members of that learning culture, that learning community, we enter into that reciprocity of learning from and with one another. And again, for me, that's one of the greatest treasures of our experience with high school redesign has been sharing ideas, not only across the province, but across the country in many respects. So we think that educators become learners and students become teachers. And so a lot of the projects, a lot of the works that we engaged in utilizing the pillars really sought to put the students at the forefront of that engagement process. Sir Ken Robinson posits that there are 3 fundamental conditions that teachers engage in terms of supporting student learning, and that the focus in education has to be centered on that. And I firmly believe that high school redesign has helped us have rich conversations and really predicate actions in terms of how we were moving forward with shifting and changing how our high schools in particular were established and set up and run. Sir Ken Robinson's book, Creative Schools, talked about the need to shift away from that agrarian model. So, when we look at the United States and the work that was happening there, it was refreshing that here in Canada, we were years ahead in terms of our thinking in what do we need to do to help shape and move and create those conditions that our kids will want and be able to learn. And so everything we do really stems from the belief that all children can and will learn given the opportunities when we create those conditions. So when we think the role of a teacher in terms of that educator role would be to inspire students with a passion for our discipline, our subject area, and to really espouse that belief that all students can achieve to the highest levels within them. And we know that that's differentiated, that will look different for every child, but that firm belief of mastery learning, of that rigorous and relevant curriculum, of those opportunities for flexible learning environments that we embraced so richly early with our work with Redesign. So I had the opportunity to start it at Archbishop O'Leary High School, and then when I was appointed principal of Louis Saint Laurent School, that's when I had the great fortune to cross paths with Vince, and we did a lot of work in bringing it to Louis Saint Laurent. Louis Saint Laurent was one of the third cycles of intake. The second facet is that as educators, as teachers, we instill confidence. We help students acquire the skills and knowledge that they need to become confident, independent learners. And when we think of Redesign in terms of engagement, this is what we wanted to engage students through that gradual release of responsibility, providing more student voice and choice in the educational decisions that they were exposed to on a day-to-day basis. And the third enabling condition, if you would, is promoting creativity. So when we think of our cross-curricular competencies, we think of critical thinking, information management. Ken Robinson referred to this as the disposition for original thinking. These are very powerful pieces of work that we have embarked upon. And I think really, to me, the work in Redesign really has shone the light on how schools, how jurisdictions were looking at doing things in slightly different, more meaningful ways in terms of the traditional Carnegie unit, locked in time and space type of models. So if those are the three elements for great teaching, then the conditions to support our teachers is incumbent upon school leadership. So school leadership must create the conditions for teachers. Teachers in turn create the conditions for their students. But for leaders to do this, there are implications for leadership, in particular how it impacts the school culture. And our work with Redesign really was predicated on shifting school culture. So in many respects, when we started with the various pillars of Redesign, it was kind of a jigsaw puzzle. Where do we start? What pieces fit together best? How does this all work? And we framed it, of course, with the TQS, LQS, and SLQS. Of course, we had the draft forms of these, 2016-ish, and certainly when they came into effect September 1st, 2019, it was refreshing to see how well aligned the pillars of Redesign are in terms of the indicators within the quality standard. Okay, in the chat, and Vince is going to moderate the chat, can anybody tell me what this is? We'll give a few minutes here. Should we have some Jeopardy music or something fun like that?
Modeling wait time.
Modeling wait time, that's right. Okay, so what do you see on the screen here?
Still waiting.
Any sailors out there?
Still waiting.
Okay.
Technical difficulties. Two ropes tied together.
Okay, two ropes tied together. Yes, absolutely.
Someone wrote a reed knot. Someone wrote a knot.
Okay, it is a knot, and it's actually a reef knot. R-E-E-F, a reef knot. Does anybody know the purpose of a reef knot?
they're thinking is coming on here.
As an aside, this reef knot is it's an international symbol of brotherhood and sisterhood. It's used by Scouting Canada to represent those concepts.
So we have purpose doesn't slip, to tie a boat to a dock, it adjusts.
Okay, some great answers coming in. And so the purpose of a reef knot is to join two ropes of equal length or approximately equal diameter together. Why do we show you this? When we think of the pillars of redesign, there is no one that has any more or less importance over the other. Similarly, when we think of the teacher quality standard, the leader quality standard, there's no one competency or indicator that really is any more or less important. But often it is a case of what do you put together, what do you tie together or bring together in terms of helping your staff lean into that work or to support that work. And so what I'd like to share with you from the LQS, two strands, two competencies that I would like to tie together for your consideration, because these are the two that we tie together in terms of predicating our work for reentry, for our COVID response, and certainly in terms of those educator roles and responsibilities in preparing our teachers to be ready to be nimble and responsive to our COVID reality. So the first is leading a learning community. What we have simply done here is the verbs are in green and the nouns are in blue. And so a leader nurtures, sustains, and supports. We nurture that learning culture. We support an evidence-informed teaching and learning practice. When we look at 4A, it's building the capacity of teachers to respond to the learning needs of all students. And clearly, we've learned from last spring through the emergent online learning to our shift this fall to more of an authentic online teaching and learning stance, that we not only had to build capacity, but we had to realize a greater level of capacity in terms of what we had in the spring. And so our teachers have to respond to those learning needs of all students. I am tying that together with providing instructional leadership within your classroom, within your school, within your jurisdiction. A leader ensures that every student has access to quality teaching and optimum learning experiences. So back to Sir Ken Robinson's work on creating conditions for optimal student learning. This language is beautifully woven into the quality standards, but prior to that, it's sourced in the work of high school redesign. And for us, we've noticed that over time, the pillars are really holding up in terms of the research that was put into bringing them forward. Thank you, Vince. So ultimately, developing a shared responsibility for the success of all students is one of the strongest educator roles and responsibilities that we all have, particularly in a time of COVID. So developing this shared response speaks to collective efficacy. So how have the pillars of redesign shaped our reentry planning here in Edmonton Catholic Schools? Again, these are the pillars of high school redesign. We know they're more than a matter of time. When we first started out, we thought about flexible learning, flex block. Those types of pieces is how we kind of at an entry level started. But we quickly realized, particularly in terms of mastery learning and assessment, and Vince and I have done a lot of work and projects in terms of that we really needed to push beyond flexible learning environments, because really you're in person or you're at home learning right now. So the challenges that we have were, of course, very similar to challenges that you are all encountering and have encountered as part of COVID. We had to plan for the return of in-person learning since the shutdown in March. We gave our families the opportunity to select between online or in-person. and we had about 28% choose online. So that's just around 13,000 of our almost 44,000 students. One of the biggest shifts we did was the pivot to a quarterly model. So back to a teaching culture, a learning culture. We know that sometimes that change can be challenging, change can be difficult. And in the high school milieu, we know that it can be downright challenging at times. However, all of our high schools have been involved in high school redesign fully since 2017. And we had 6 of our schools involved in the first, second, third, fourth intakes. So for the better part of the past decade, our teachers and our admin teams have been living the pillars of high school redesign. We credit that to how quickly we were able to pivot and adjust in being flexible in terms of that shift from semester to quarterly. We also looked at implementing pacing guides for in-person and online learning. We need that rigor and relevance of curriculum, and so that was a big undertaking. And so Vince will talk more in short order about how do we support teachers' professional learning, planning, delivery, and assessment through collective efficacy in terms of our response to COVID. And so what we really talked about intentionally was we have to look at these ideas, okay? So we're gonna shift 13,000 people online. We're gonna shift to quarterly. We're gonna provide a pacing document for teachers to kind of move forward together in understanding what are the priority outcomes and how they need to address that in terms of assessment and authentic assessment. So we talked a lot about that noun, our intention to implementation, to actually living and doing and delivering that. So this is something that Vince will speak to, and he'll be sharing with you a model that we are utilizing in Edmonton Catholic. If you go to ecsd.net, you will see the landing page takes you to our reentry plan. In the front matter of our plan, it was important for me to make a statement, and it was predicated on Bandura's social learning theory. And again, think back to engagement and learning from and with each other. That level of engagement is one of the touchstones of high school redesign. And so when faced with the challenge of reentry and COVID, we wanted to understand the importance of imparting into all of our staff that we believe in their capability, that we wanted to view COVID as a challenge to be mastered rather than as a threat to be avoided. And again, our prior work with redesign paid dividends in terms of our level to be responsive and pivot for that. So when we think of collective efficacy, I think it's incumbent upon us as our educator role and as part of our responsibilities to first and foremost understand the effective state. So you will see the 4 facets of Bandura's social learning theory here in terms of collective efficacy. You're going to see them in the reverse order of impact. So mastery learning, of course, having the greatest impact or effect, and that's the pinnacle of our aspirations. But what COVID has brought us to understand is we first and foremost need to put on our own oxygen mask first. So this is why we looked at the effective state. How are people feeling? What is their state of mental health? What challenges, what's keeping us awake at night? What's give us anxiety? On the flip side, what motivates us? What encourages us? What gives us hope? What challenges us? What can we take solace and comfort in? So really it is to look at the whole group and understand where are we at in terms of our response? How are we feeling about COVID? How are we feeling about the shifts in teaching and learning that we're going to have to lean into and press into in the months ahead? And so this takes us then to that social persuasion piece. So we're talking about shifts in learning stance. We're encouraging teachers to take some more risks and to try things in terms of more synchronous instruction, particularly for those in an online environment. So, and again, with our leadership teams, those conversations of, you've got this, we believe in you. And again, there was that agency and urgency, particularly in leveraging the voice of stakeholders, that was very familiar to us because of our work in redesign. So next we lead into vicarious learning. With 13,000 students online, we still needed the balance of our teachers to be in person in classroom. So we had to hire more teachers. So we've hired about 97 more teachers in Edmonton Catholic, and we have some beginner teachers. So we need to be able to provide modeling of high impact strategies. We need to engage them in those rich conversations and the history and the lessons learned through our workings with redesign, but also in leaning into the teacher quality standard, leadership quality standard, in really tying together those best practices and approaches in terms of creating those conditions for optimal student learning. This ultimately takes us to mastery learning, that gradual release of responsibility where we encourage, we give practice opportunities, model, mentor, and then we let others do for themselves. And so this is the big shift for us from the spring. This is more of the intentionality we're bringing into our teaching and learning stance moving forward. And again, you know, I've said it countless times now, but we believe that that's really been attributable to the work we've done with redesign. When I first took over as principal at Louis Saint Laurent School, I had the wonderful task to bring a whole staff forward into redesign. And this was the guiding quotation that we used that year. This would have been in 2013 from Harvard religious educator Thomas Groom. A great educator has the ability to lead people to new places where even the educator has never been. And I think this speaks to our redesign journey all those years ago, and it has put us in good stead to navigate the challenges that remain ahead. So speaking of great educators, at this time, I'm going to pass things over to Vince. And Vince is now going to take us through some professional learning, collaboration, and impact on quality teaching. Over to you, Vince.
Thank you so much. I think it would be a good place to start. This next half is going to be a little more interactive in the chat. So we'll start with a warm-up. Since we had this wonderful Thomas Groom quote, why don't you indicate in the chat where you're from? And I can almost guarantee you there are probably some places that I have never been physically. As we start to kind of engage in professional learning and collaboration, I'd love to hear where you're from. I'm a social studies person, so geography and history and culture is a big passion of mine. I see coming in on the chat, we're all around Alberta, from Stirling all the way to Grimshaw, Stony Plain, Calgary, Brooks, fantastic. So keep your fingers warm because we're going to be participating in some kind of interactive chats. So when we look at professional learning and collaboration, which are two of the pillars of high school redesign, it's important for us to acknowledge that those are rooted, as Tim acknowledged, and they're all kind of linked together. They're rooted together. They're all part of this same kind of tree that feeds learning for students. And when we think about our impact on students, we want to talk about this notion that our students deserve instruction that is both rigorous and relevant. So your first task in the chat is to indicate what do the words rigorous and relevant instruction mean? And I'm going to model pacing and waiting time and let the chat populate. So what do the words rigorous and relevant mean to you? High standards, authentic, meaningful with high standards. I know there are 30 people in this chat, 32 people here, so I'll wait a little bit longer. Something that is creative and challenging, fantastic, thank you. No fluff, I like that, right to the point, no fluff. Force the students out of their comfort zone, but is relevant in nature. Perfect. So if we look at the actual information that is provided to us on the pillars of redesign, we would note that rigorous and relevant learning experiences are directly applicable to students' lives. They should include active learning, problem solving, and reasoning to demonstrate the student's understanding of learning outcomes. They should focus on application of concepts and skills. They should, the teaching materials and assessment strategies should be aligned with the curriculum, rigor, and relevance. And I find that the further we entrench ourselves in this COVID-19 situation that we find ourselves in, oftentimes we deviate away from the curriculum, which is really the #1 driver of instruction. And so I want to offer this metaphor. On the left side of the line in the sand, we would have found ourselves March 16th or around March 16th, I think was the time. It was a Sunday evening when I got the call saying we're going to be shutting down schools. And I remember thinking, I don't know what the rest of the year is going to look like. And it really felt like an emergency situation. We were gathering resources, we were sharing resources. The collaboration across the province was through the roof and commendable to all divisions who engaged in those collaboration sessions. But then we had our summer break and we were still practicing social isolation. COVID is still prevalent. But I like to think that when we came back from summer vacation, whether you wanted to or not, there was a specific line drawn in the sand. And now we are tasked as educators to provide a non-emergency type of instruction in a pandemic. So the considerations that teachers have to make in their delivery of instruction, in their collection of assignments and feedback gathering is really, or must really be explicit. So when we think about that line in the sand, I challenge you to kind of draw that line in the sand for yourself and moving forward saying, we are no longer in an emergency situation. There are some standards we must uphold, as was mentioned by Tim in TQS and LQS. And one of the realities of our learning environments are that they've shifted. And for us who have been engaged in redesign, we are a little more comfortable with those shifts. And a major shift that occurred in Edmonton Catholic schools was a move to the quarterly system. And so I'm going to take a second to acknowledge the chat here. And I would like you to tell me what your situation is. Is it online? Is it face-to-face? Is it both? But most importantly, or not most importantly, but most attached to this slide, are you engaging in a quarterly system or not? And I'm going to give you a second to participate. So face-to-face, I see on the chat. Semesters, quarters, face-to-face and learning, in-person, regular schedule. Face-to-face. Okay, so we have a nice kind of eclectic mix. Some people face-to-face, some people online, some people quarters. One of the main comments I get from teachers who are currently teaching in the city but used to teach in country schools is this is very, very similar to when you get thrown into a small country school in which you have to teach 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and they're all in 1 or 2 rooms. And so this notion of maintaining rigor and relevance in a shifting learning environment is not new to everyone. However, with this impact of the quarterly system, Edmonton Catholic Schools really had to consider this shift of time. And I know we've discussed this notion of time previously, but we want to get away from this idea that we have a condensed period of time, so we must simply get through programs. We do need to shift our focus away from extraneous elements of instruction. So someone already put no fluff, so I will just use that. We need to move away from the fluff. And a statement that was said to myself and some of my colleagues in a professional learning session was, we need to really consider what students need to know versus what is neat to know. And that's been driving our practice. That's been driving our professional learning sessions that we've been putting on. But it's very, very important to acknowledge that there's a possibility and a potential for refocus here. Our teachers will need to refocus the purpose of their instruction. Our teachers will need to refocus their reliance on resources. Oftentimes when I work elbow to elbow with teachers, I find that the discussion revolves around what page they're on in a textbook or what chapter the exam is going to be on. And to maintain rigor and relevance, we need to shift away from our reliance on resources and shift back to a reliance on our programs of studies, which brings us to these pillars of redesign. Really, it's more than a matter of time. And if we take away this notion that time is what is going to measure our success, we can start to kind of open up our mind a little bit and understand that these pillars, as they work so intricately together, can create learning experiences for students that where students can thrive regardless of the amount of face-to-face or online time you have with your students. And so in the chat, my question for you to consider, and I'll give you a little bit more time to process here, is how might we continue to apply the principles of rigorous and relevant curriculum in the wake of COVID-19? And I would like to pause for a little bit longer, and I'd like you to kind of reflect a little bit longer and enter your comments in the chat so we can engage in a dialogue around this, because I feel like this is a problem that a lot of teachers have been asking, or a question a lot of teachers have been asking.
Okay, we're back.
So the first comment, give students ownership of their learning, show them the curricular outcomes, and be bold enough to ask them how they would like to learn. I love that, the bold statement. I think boldness is something that is not lacking in teachers who have engaged in the redesign pillars.
Yeah, it really speaks to courage. It speaks to, viewing it as, again, something to be mastered rather than something to be avoided.
Mm-hmm. Wait a couple more seconds for any others. How does COVID connect to content? Social studies with media influences, science with bacteria studies, math with exponential algorithms. Another comment, reevaluate how we plan, instruct, and assess. I love these answers coming in. You guys are fantastic. The COVID connections, I'm a social studies person, so I definitely made the connections to social studies, but the mathematics connection to COVID is fantastic. So as we move on, we want to reconsider, if we're reconsidering how we approach instruction, and we're reconsidering how we're going to approach leading, and we reconsider how students are engaging in learning environments, we must also reconsider our professional learning. Our professional learning should seek to consider the impact that we have on student learning. I've been very fortunate to work very closely with John Hattie over the past 12 months. And one of the books that I've read of his, 10 Mind Frames for Visible Learning, highlights the mind frames that teachers should have to ensure they have the greatest impact on what he calls a visible learning classroom. As I was preparing for the session today, and I was reflecting on these 10 mind frames, I made an association. I realized that the mind frames exist already in our pillars of redesign. And the mind frames specifically are these. I'm an evaluator of my impact on student learning. I can see assessment as informing my impact and next steps. I collaborate with others about my progress and impact, and so on and so forth. I want to leave this up, and I would like you to read through them, because we are going to engage in another chat in a few seconds here about these mind frames specifically. So as you're reading through these, please indicate in the chat which mind frame resonates with you the most. You don't have to write the whole thing, you can just put the number. So as you're reading through these, please enter in the chat which mind frame resonates with you the most? And I'll give you some time to do that. 9, 2, 9, 7, lots of 9s, 7s, dialogue and monologue. 2, assessment is informed by next steps. 3, collaborate with others. 2, 4, thank you so much. I feel like these mind frames kind of ebb and flow as our teaching context changes. Right now, 9 is exceptionally important. Engaging in relationships and trust with our students. And I'm not saying it's not important when we're not in a pandemic, but sometimes these mind frames float to the surface in their application or the necessity of their application. And right now, I feel like building relationships and trust is absolutely fundamental to further the learning environment with our students and to further a safe place for them to learn. It's really important for our students to feel safe. So you have your mind frame that you've chosen. Which pillar in the chat, which pillar of redesign resonates the most with the mind frame you selected? And this I'll take a little bit more time for you to consider.
You're muted.
Perfect. Yeah, we were muted just to try to model some wait time, which I've been trying really hard on doing. So as people are filling in the chat, I'm seeing assessment with number 4, assessment with number 2, meaningful relationships, personalization, fantastic, meaningful relationships. As the chat continues to populate, I think it's important that we're making these explicit connections between research and our pillars, because naturally these overlap. And it's important to acknowledge the fact that the professional learning that we engage in can overlap with elements of our professional learning that we've already experienced, which kind of takes me to the next part of the chat or of our discussion here, which is understanding that we have professional learning to support instruction. So much like we need to organize our teaching, maybe we're reformatting it into a quarterly system, or maybe we reformatted our teaching into online or hybrid or face-to-face or some sort of schmozzle of all of the above. We should seek professional learning that aligns with those high quality practices. So professional learning sessions should seek to maximize the opportunity for teachers and leaders to engage in practices that support their philosophies of teaching and leading. You've chosen a philosophy, a mind frame, let's say. You've chosen a pillar of redesign. We need to be more explicit in the professional learning that we choose to engage in. And that is kind of where I've been taking some of my learning. So professional learning with colleagues is probably the best place to start. Hopefully you're working in a school that engages in some collaboration, which is also another pillar of redesign. But by leveraging our colleagues, we can engage in metacognitive reflections about that main question. If we engage in conversations about what works best for learners, we can then choose the appropriate tool, strategy, or activity for our students to engage. What I was finding when we were engaging in emergency remote learning, and I'm sure you realize this too, especially if you're on Facebook, it seemed like everybody had a tool. There was all these free digital tools. There was a combination of teachers who were curating resources and sharing freely, and it was fantastic. But what the residual effect of that was that teachers were choosing the tools before they were acknowledging the impact of that tool. And so step 1, and a lot of you indicated mind frame number 9, that kind of leaks through into this notion that the student should determine the tool, the tool should not determine the learning. So as we're moving forward and we've drawn that line in the sand, we now need to engage in practices that seek to discover dispositions about our students, and then we move to choosing which tool or strategy or assessment or activity would engage the learner, not the other way around. So we want to move from intention to implementation. I purposefully chose this photo, Mind the Gap, and I'm going to test, hopefully you're not going to move forward if you have the slides downloaded, but I'm going to test your knowledge in the chat. What do you think the purpose of this photo, this image, in relation, or how do you think this photo relates to the notion from intention to implementation? So I'll say that one more time as you're gathering your thoughts and about to enter them into the chat. What is the relationship that exists between the photo, Mind the Gap, and the title from intention to implementation? And I'll give you 2 minutes to put that in the chat before we continue on.
And we're live.
So I see, don't assume anything. The tool cannot replace instruction. Resources are available to students. There's often a gap between the two. That's just it. So if you've ever been fortunate enough to travel in the tube in London, the announcement says Mind the Gap. And that's where I kind of took this analogy from, because what tends to happen is teachers and leaders attend a lot of professional learning. And oftentimes you leave professional learning with the highest of intentions and motivations. You've seen something that's absolutely revolutionized your thought. And then a week goes by, a month goes by, you have a pile of papers to grade. Maybe you're taking on a new fitness regime and dieting, but there tends to be a gap between intention and implementation. And this is where I have been existing in my professional learning. How can we bridge that gap? What can we do? Should we decide to implement the pillars of redesign? How can we know that we've bridged the gap between intention and implementation? And further to that, how can I measure the impact that I'm having on my students? And so as I've engaged in some research and work with colleagues across the division, we discovered through the research of John Hattie a model for implementation. The model is affectionately called the DIE model. The DIE model stands for diagnose, intervene, implement, and evaluate. And I'd like to take you through the DIE model as a means for implementation. Hattie's DIE model provides a framework for us in which teachers and leaders can systematically evaluate the impact they have on student learning. So when we look at the DIE model, the first step of the DIE model is diagnosis, which I affectionately call the discovery phase. So step one is diagnosis or discovery, because oftentimes I feel like when we use the term diagnosis, it indicates that there's an ailment or an illness that needs to be repaired. And that's not the message that I would like to relay. The message I would like to relay is that what we are doing in phase one is using various assessment strategies to understand what students bring to the lesson, which can include prior knowledge, motivations, and willingness to learn. There are studies out there that indicate that 80% of what a teacher talks about in class is already known to a student or can be Googled by a student. And so if we can engage in practices that seek to understand what students know prior to the delivery of that information, we can maximize our time in phase two and phase three. The second phase is intervention. So after we've engaged in diagnosis and discovery of our students, we then choose our intervention. And in this case, it's called an intervention. We can call it a strategy. We can call it a practice. We can call it something that we've seen on Edutopia. We can call it a tool. But it's important to understand that we need to have an arsenal of interventions in case one doesn't work, in case we are in a classroom that is differentiated, And so in addition to knowing these high probability interventions, we have to know when to adapt them and when to apply thoughtful design in their planning and learning, which goes back to what I said before. We need to know the student before we know the tool. Otherwise, we're not going to have that impact. Moving through this model for implementation, the third phase is implementation. So after we've discovered our students and the dispositions they bring to our classrooms, and we've chosen or selected our tool based on an arsenal that we have or a toolkit that we have, we then need to implement this strategy. So we need to have a deep knowledge and understanding of the practices required to implement anything well. And what tends to happen in our classrooms is we stop here. We stop at the implementation phase. I've done a check-in with my students. I've determined that the jigsaw is going to work, and I know how to apply the jigsaw. So in step 3, I apply the jigsaw, and then that's Friday, Saturday and Sunday goes by, and then Monday we re-engage in a new intervention. So we're missing a critical component of implementation. And this is also very possible with teachers who engage in professional learning. We have these professional learning tools, we try to implement them, and then we just kind of stop at 3. Possibly the most important aspect of this model and the most under-researched aspect of this model is this evaluation. We need to know and we need to measure the impact of our implementation. So knowing the skills and having multiple methods and collaboratively debating with colleagues the magnitude of the implementation. So the gap exists between 2 and 3, oftentimes. We choose an intervention and we don't implement it with fidelity. But an even larger gap exists between step 3 and step 4. We implement, we don't evaluate. And it's important to acknowledge the fact that evaluation should take place in a dialogue and not a monologue, which was one of the mind frames. Students should equally evaluate the impact you had on their learning as you should. And so when we can engage in metacognition with our students and engage in conversations with our students about how did that work, what could have happened differently, and allowing the student to be part of their learning will revolutionize the progress that our students can make in our classrooms. So after we finish, level 4 of evaluation, we would use the evaluation to re-engage in a discovery process. So this model for implementation, the DIE model of implementation, can exist and spins like a wheel over the course of a quarter, over the course of a semester, over the course of a grade, and if done with proper fidelity, can be an ever-rotating cycle for an entire student career. And this is the model that we based this book on. So as I had mentioned previously, I was fortunate enough to work very closely with John Hattie and the other co-authors mentioned on the book there to write a book called Great Teaching by Design. And essentially what Great Teaching by Design seeks to do is to leverage that DIE model and provide context and applications and strategies for teachers to engage in to complete a cycle of the DIE model in which we've termed the Great Teaching by Design cycle. And so the comment there, that was a reviewer comment that exists on that slide, indicates exactly what the intention was. And it's the same intention that we have with redesign. Pillars of redesign, strategies, the DIE model will not exist and will not have a great impact unless teachers make the deliberate decision to engage. And so we are at this crossroads where three weeks into the longest September that I can remember in my career, and we're already tired. And I think everyone across schools in general are experiencing fatigue. But if we can leap over the gap and we can engage in explicit and deliberate decisions in our classroom and evaluate those decisions, we can find this happy medium in a COVID era redesign school that allows for greater impact on student learning?
Great, thanks, Vince. So here we are, just over 10 years since high school redesign emerged in Alberta. And so think about your journey. Think about the conversations, the discussions that you've had with staff, with admin, within your jurisdiction. I think if we were to use that evaluative lens and to look back, we find that the pillars of redesign do stand up to the research and the test of time. Certainly in our experience and working with our teachers, so prior to my role as deputy, which I started in June and had the great job of getting the division ready for re-entry for this fall, I had the great fortune of working in learning services where we're having learning conversations daily, where we were looking at those lessons learned in terms of the research and where we are and where we'd like to go. And again, from that intention to implementation, how do we span that gap? And I know that Vince's work within the construct of his service as social studies consultant, and clearly in his work in visible learning, is predicated in that intentional and meaningful work that we've done over the past decade in terms of redesign. So perhaps in the chat, if you would be so kind as to what's one highlight for you in terms of your journey with redesign. So we'll give you just a couple of moments to share a highlight, something that really stood out for you in terms of how this has helped shape and move your practice or your learning culture, your learning community forward. So seeing some great responses. So we're looking at learning outside of the classroom, so transcending the four walls. Our school is brand new to high school redesign, so I'm just learning what it's all about, and I will what it will look like for us. So that's from a small rural independent school. And again, to one of our earlier points, the power of the network that the work in high school redesign has generated over the past decade is phenomenal. So there are a lot of school communities, jurisdictions you can reach out to. And that was one of the big lessons for us in terms of we're not going to invent the Mark I version. We actually saw what other jurisdictions were doing, learned from their practice, entered into some really great dialogue. And when we were looking at implementing a new strategy or approach, we were able to glean the wisdom and the benefits of those earlier iterations for our implementation. So again, as our time with you draws near a close, we just want to reiterate how the pillars of redesign and our encounter with redesign has certainly helped pave the way for the implementation of the necessary strategies and tools that we're using as part of our reentry response, and certainly has really helped shape the importance of collective efficacy. Again, we want to go where no educators have gone before, and COVID is really allowing us opportunity to do that. And it is through that viewing it as a challenge to be mastered rather than a task to be avoided. Clearly, it is helping us understand our educator roles and responsibilities. So at this time, we thank you for your attention and participation today. And if there are any questions, we're more than happy to take a few moments to engage in some further conversations with you.
Tim and Vince, while we're waiting for people to write messages in, and I apologize, my computer crashed and everything fell apart, and Vince, thanks for stepping in. And actually, you guys are great because you covered off some of the things that have been the learnings from Alberta Ed when you talk about the foundational principles or pillars and how much they have been so embedded into the work of schools and how they have continued and supported the journeys that we are on now. I would have been redundant with what I had to say with what you've added to it, and just talking about the journeys and everyone being on a different journey. Interesting to hear people that are just starting it, and I think about you who've been on this for a number of years, and so it's just, this is the way we do things, sort of thing. So have you got any questions there? Do you want to do this? One other thing maybe while I've got the floor is just to remind people that next Wednesday is our last webinar, and we're going to do Patrick's book, Reassessment in High School to Foster Growth Mindset. And I think it's a perfect lead in from talking about growth mindsets and mindsets. He's going to talk about, he's from Calgary Catholic, a school's journey towards best practice in assessment and reassessment, exploring areas of success and failures, along with supports to put in place to effectively reassess with a focus on fostering a growth mindset. So I think our webinars have been very, very much intertwined and have built up a good way to move forward in this time. So I'm not too sure if we have any. Debbie's talk about the research connections. So I know it's probably been a very long day for you and for everyone who's been listening. So I think I will just thank you. And once again, we were going to hear you in the spring. I was so glad we were able to move it forward, seeing as how the world kind of imploded in March just before you presented. So once again, thank you, gentlemen. And this recording will be sent out to participants today, and it will also be posted on the Moving Forward with High School Redesign website. So thank you, gentlemen.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Stay well.
Merci
Take care.
beaucoup.